We've introduced the three concepts that make a brace neutral spine work, and that remember that those things are: one, that my feet are straight so I can create torsion; two, I've got my glutes engaged a little bit; and three, I can create stiffness in the ab and the trunk musculature to help control the spine. All right, so that makes sense. I've got these three kind of big guns working for me. The hip stabilizes the spine. Because my spine and pelvis are organized, I'm able to create good torsion through the hip, reciprocating the stability. Well, what's the problem with sitting then? Because sitting gets a bad rap, right? But it turns out that once you understand the components to spinal stabilization, you'll look at sitting a little bit different. For example, if I sit down and even maintain the two-hand rule, and I'm getting a good organized position here, and then if all I have to do here is try to apply the three principles of creating stability here. So you recall the first one was, hey, my feet are straight, check, that's okay. Two is I'm going to squeeze my butt, and you'll see that that doesn't do a lot in this position to reorientate my pelvis. I can lower myself up and down, but I'm not going to be able to maintain that position for very long. So the problem here is that I've automatically knocked out my ability to maintain a relationship between my femur and my pelvis in this position, because my glutes don't work in that shape at the bottom position of the squat or when I'm sitting down. So it's difficult for me to use that strong musculature to counteract what's happening. Okay, well, you're like, okay, you've got your abs still, Kelly. Well, great. So I can find a neutral-ish position. I'm not sure, because I don't have those landmarks of around that I usually feel around my pelvis when I squeeze my butt. But I can engage, I can create some stiffness here. So now I've got my abs stiff, I can do that. And the third component is the rotation. And I'm realizing here that when I sit down, I'm having a hard time creating the amount of stiffness and torsion required of the hip to actually stabilize. So what ends up happening if we look at sitting through the model of how we're stabilizing through the rest of our functional model or functional movements, what we're seeing is that we have 1 out of 3 of the systems working, and those are my abdominals. Because my glutes are knocked out, and also I'm in this sort of capsular neutral no man's land where I can't create enough torsion to create stability in the pelvis and help me modulate this. So what ends up happening is that the pelvis starts gimbaling back and forth, and after a while I'm going to fatigue and I'll start looking for tension. And we call this tension hunting, that the athlete or the person sitting down is realizing that they're fatigued or can't maintain that shape, and so they'll default to mechanically inefficient positions, but that feel like they're not walking around. So right now I'm literally just hanging on the tissue, or as we say, hanging on the meat of my back. So it feels like I'm stable, but you can see from the side that this is clearly not a position I want to engender as an athletic shape. In fact, it's an important note here that posture is usually the language that people describe when they're in these sitting or static positions. And people will regularly brag, oh, I don't have very good posture, I've always had bad posture, my mom says my posture is terrible. Turns out posture is actually a Latin derivative of a word that means position. Posture means position, and what you're really bragging about is that you have really bad position. In this case, posture tends to relate to the organization of the spine. So let's stop using this prissy word that means position. Let's start talking about the robustness of your position. When I'm sitting in a shape that I can't maintain the integrity of, I'm ultimately going to try to achieve stability, and I'll either do that through flexion or hopefully less bad than flexion is extension. But even this position, if I translate that to a sitting model, is not very good. One of the issues, again, with sitting, besides not only having one model of stability, is that here I have no way to control my torso as I'm sitting on my ischial tuberosity. So I'm on the sitting aspect of my hip bones here, and I can find that bony structure. But once again, the problem is that I'm just wobbling back and forth because I don't have any way to keep this up. And so what we start to see is the compensation. The rectus femoris, which is one of the heads of the quadriceps that goes from the kneecap to the lower spine of the pelvis, starts to become tight. So it's doing the job of keeping my pelvis forward. So now I've just introduced a static long habit load into my quadriceps, which I'm going to need. In fact, in the early literature, they describe people who went to the theater as having something called theater sign. When they sat in the theater for long periods of time, their kneecaps would hurt. And what was really happening is because we were sitting in these chairs without the right stabilization, the rectus femoris, head of the quadriceps, would start to pull because it's pulling my pelvis upright into this neutral shape, and my knees would start to ache, a downstream effect of an upstream problem. Additionally, we start to see that the psoas, which is that big, powerful flexor that attaches from the front of the spine and runs into the pelvis, starts to become tonically shortened because it's also trying to maintain the integrity of my spine. In the iliacus, which is the musculature inside my pelvis that runs to the femur, suddenly what you can see is that we have three systems. I have a system that goes from femur to pelvis, spine to femur, and then pelvis to femur. And these three tissues start to become very, very shortened. And if this is the position I'm spending a lot of time in, they're going to adapt to that shape so that when I need to come up and start to extend the hip, I'm going to have a hard time. When I need to create more length and by being able to squat, I'm also going to have a hard time. And we're going to start to see compensations in the low back. So number one, sitting doesn't afford me the availability of the way I'm designed, which is to be able to have these three mechanisms of stability working for me. And two, I see a whole bunch of adaptation errors around it. Turns out sitting on the ground makes a lot of sense. And you'll notice that sitting on the ground looks a lot like lotus position or sitting cross-legged. And when we sit at this end range of flexion and external rotation, the hip capsule starts to be mechanically activated in this end range. And once again, oh hey, I've started to put a little bit more stability in the system. While my glutes don't work, now I have 2 out of the 3 of the stabilization mechanisms. And no wonder when I'm sitting in lotus position, trying to meditate, I'm turning my hands up. That's winding the shoulders into a stable position. The hips get wound up into this flexion, external rotate position. And now I have reciprocating stability at the shoulders, allows my head to be neutral. And I have stability through the pelvis lumbar, allowing me to sit in a good shape. Why sitting on the ground is still a win. The key concept here is that if this is the position you're spending all your time in, your brain recognizes this position as a pattern. And that pattern becomes a practice pattern. So your chief and dominant experience and your chief trait as an athlete is a crunched over sitting one. Best idea here, make a better decision.